Welcome everyone to Hotel Tech Unwrapped, episode 3, brought to you by IMS. The purpose of this podcast is to simplify hospitality technology so we can empower hospitality decision makers to generate a better return from their technology investments. My name is Denis Ahern.
And my name is Helena Brien. And in today's session, we're going to take a deep dive into hotel Wi-Fi. So Denis, before we kick off, because I know we're both super excited to talk about this subject, what's the feedback been like following last week's session on hotel tech and the ecosystem?
Yeah, I've had a few interesting bits of feedback, Helena, on a personal level and just from a content perspective, right? So on the content side, people are surprised about how vast the hospitality technology ecosystem is. We have since shared that visual from Irrevoke, for example, which becomes a really useful visual aid to understand what we're speaking about in the episode, but also just to look at and say, right, where am I at in my hotel with this technology? So that has definitely been sort of the main feedback in relation to the content.
Yeah.
The personal feedback has been, I look very tired when we do these podcasts, right? And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. I have 2 kids under 3, so sleep can be a little bit patchy, you know. But yes, it's been interesting. I've been getting all sorts of feedback, but those are the 2 highlights.
It's a good job you're not sensitive, Denis. I have found the feedback actually really interesting. So from a professional point of view, like what people, their takeaways from the podcast were, they didn't realize that the hotel tech stack, that ecosystem is so vast. And it was when they went back to their business and they started to look, okay, what do I actually use within the business? You know, how relevant was that podcast to my business, and where are there new opportunities for me to explore? But they actually realized that there's so much being used, and it's just become part of the norm, that, you know, there's a reliance on this technology very shortly after you start using it. So I thought it was really, really interesting that it just, once it starts in the business, you adapt, you deal with it, and it just becomes the part of the normal day. Now, from a personal point of view, I thought it was very funny how a number of people came to me and said, yourself and Denis sounded far more relaxed this week. You know, far more relaxed. Did you get rid of the stage fright? They only knew how nervous I personally was before we went live at any point. But it was great to hear that, you know, we were talking about a subject that we're very passionate about, that we understand is growing all of the time. So to hear that, I suppose we got lost in the conversation, so to speak. So that just naturally came out, which was super. But today's topic, which actually is going to be in 2 parts, so we're going to have it today and another one following, will be on Wi-Fi, which we have spoken for hours about hotel Wi-Fi. So I suppose our learning from this is break it down to 2 parts, make it easier listening for people. But I really want to kick off, if that's okay with you. Excellent. So I worked in the hospitality sector for over 16 years. For me, Wi-Fi, I think it was 2008 when it first came into hotels as something that guests were expecting, and they were willing to pay for it at the time, right? But Wi-Fi, up until quite recently, was just a service that we offered our hotel guests. And it didn't seem as important as the breakfast or, you know, other services that we saw were important. But I recently read a really interesting Revenate blog on why Wi-Fi is keeping hotels from receiving 5-star reviews. Now, I found it very interesting how the research showed that the perfect Wi-Fi is expected. We have it at home at the end of the day. But when there are any issues with the Wi-Fi experience for the hotel guests, the guests themselves can't award the hotel a 5-star on any one of the platforms, whether it's a review site that you have yourself or whether it's the OTAs. They just can't award it. So what's that doing to the hotel? It's driving down the hotel's average score online and impacting on their online reputation. So the question I have for you, Denis, is how important is good hotel Wi-Fi?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's a great question. And so a couple of quick points is that in episode 1, obviously we covered the importance of guest scores and online reputation. So Booking.com have that free Wi-Fi category that's publicly available, and we know that impacts on occupancy, ADR, RevPAR. Episode 2, that hospitality ecosystem, actually Wi-Fi was only shown in one box in like
Mhm.
a big map of well over 50 kind of categories on that map, right? Which is very interesting. Today, I can enlighten you from some recent conversations about actually how much everything in a hotel depends on reliable Wi-Fi.
Mhm.
And yeah, your point in relation to the guest scores is really important. Even in my own home, if I went home this evening, I really love my home, right? We have put a lot of work into setting it up the way we want it to be, etc. But if I don't have Wi-Fi when I go home this evening, I wouldn't be giving it like a 10 out of 10 for experience tonight, because there's so much in my personal life, and I know everyone can relate to that depends on Wi-Fi, right? Um, what we like to do to simplify things for hospitality is talk about principles of great Wi-Fi,
Mhm.
and we in IMS have trimmed it down to 5, right? These are principles that you can reflect upon. You can ask your existing service provider questions around these areas. And I think that's a really useful place to start, right? Because as
Okay.
we move on into conversation, everything kind of links back to these 5 things. So trying to simplify it as much as we can, okay?
Mhm.
So the first one we always say is make sure you choose the right product. So a reputable brand that is designed for a hospitality environment and delivered by an experienced partner. So reputable brand delivered by an experienced partner would be principle number 1.
Before you move on to principle number 2, I have to ask the question, like, why does it have to be a reputable partner in the hospitality sector? Like, why is that hospitality brand so important
Yeah, so
for the Wi-Fi?
it's a good question, right? And so like not all Wi-Fi is the same, right? And
Okay.
in a hospitality setting, hospitality is one of the most challenging environments to deliver a really good Wi-Fi experience. And we get into the reasons for that in a while, right? But there is only 3 or 4 actual brands or products out there that have been designed specifically with hospitality in mind
Mhm.
to deal with I suppose, the dynamics of the environment, where you've got some areas where you've got loads of people in a small space. You've got other areas where it's more like the guest room areas where you want to maybe deliver a higher bandwidth. You're connecting less devices, so it's about a more expansive experience, and being flexible to do that throughout a building that has many different kind of use cases and scenarios. That's the key bit around the product or the brand, right? In terms of a partner to deploy it, like wireless networking is the hardest form of networking. There's far more variables than any other form of networking, right? And what that means is if me and you were wireless network engineers and we were handed, say, a scenario, a building, right, maybe a set of drawings, right, and we were told to design a Wi-Fi network that meets certain criteria, right, it's possible that between us we come up with 10 different solutions, right, and all of them could work. Some of them might work better than others,
Mhm.
but this is where that experience bit comes into play. There's a lot of ambiguity when it comes to Wi-Fi network design. The experience bit then becomes critical because it's not a paint by numbers situation. So hopefully that makes sense for principle 1.
I love the paint by numbers analogy.
Uh,
Don't know if I tried that while building a Wi-Fi infrastructure, but it's a great analogy to use.
yeah,
Um, okay, that's really interesting because I suppose, look, ultimately what we're here to do is educate people on why uh, on information that they can take back to their own providers, right? And they can ask questions where they're informed already. And if your Wi-Fi infrastructure isn't fit for purpose, you can start identifying
yeah.
where and why. Um,
So principle 2.
thank you.
Um, Principle 2 from our perspective is to create a really strong cable and switch network that delivers reliable connectivity via cable where you need it. Okay. So I like to equate this to, you think about your water distribution system in a hotel. You have a mains supply into the building, a mains water supply. That's like, say, a broadband connection in, right? But you have to distribute it, okay? So think of your cable and switch environments like the piping that runs throughout the building, the shower heads, the taps, the radiator, etc. Everything that connects to that network, all right? You have to get this right before you get the last piece, which is the Wi-Fi bit, okay? And if you have cables in the right locations, it makes it much easier to deliver really high quality Wi-Fi. If you have a well-designed switch network, you can obviously manage the Wi-Fi access points, but then you can start to connect other technologies such as like TV, phone, CCTV, etc. Any technology that you can think of that needs a network connection. What that allows you to do is have the minimum number of switches in your building overall. That reduces obviously your costs for installation, etc., but most importantly, reduces your energy costs and your carbon footprint. And we can go into that sustainability piece in part 2. Okay.
So if I'm a hotelier and I'm looking at my current technology in the property, right, and I have a Cat 5 or a Cat 6 in each of my rooms, I have a lot more freedom due to the cabling infrastructure of the building to enhance my guests' technology because of that cabling.
Yeah.
And if I don't, that investment may need to be required for the technology that I offer my guests, but also from an operational point of view to function more effectively and ultimately be more sustainable as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So Wi-Fi can solve all your problems in these areas. So no matter how good the access point is or how it's installed, you do need a really strong cable and switch network. And so, yeah, that's principle 2. Principle 3, always put as much as you can then in your building on cable. And this sounds like strange coming from a Wi-Fi provider, but in my own home, I connect the absolute maximum to the actual over cable. So I have a minimum amount of devices on Wi-Fi. That means the quality of that Wi-Fi experience improves dramatically for the devices that actually need Wi-Fi. So put as much as possible on cable. And I'm sure, Helena, that sounds surprising coming from a Wi-Fi provider.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I have heard the team talk about this before and explain why. And you know what, when you actually understand the reasoning behind it, just like you explained there, it makes sense because, you know, you don't want everything pulling off your Wi-Fi. So
Absolutely.
principle number 4.
Principle number 4 is to have a single site-wide managed network. Okay, so again, it's back to that reputable brand and product, right? But a hospitality environment is very dynamic, okay? And Wi-Fi in one part of your building needs to function very differently to another part of your building. So that single site-wide managed network does a number of things. It allows you to connect and roam throughout the property without getting disconnected. And it delivers an experience appropriate to the environment, so where you are in the building. And think of it like everything connecting back to one brain. If you've got 2 separate systems, it's not possible for that experience to be coordinated and to be seamless. So single site-wide managed network. Again, great question to ask your existing Wi-Fi provider.
Excellent. And we're going to cover that actually in part 2. And the example we're going to use is a conference hotel. So I think a lot of people listening will be able to relate to that. Next principle, please, Denis.
Yeah, so principle 5, broadcast the minimum number of wireless networks or SSIDs. So if you take out your phone in a hotel and you can see more than 3 wireless networks available, this is an issue because the more wireless networks you're broadcasting, this is impacting on something that we call airtime utilization. But very simply, keep your wireless networks being broadcast to 3 or less. And this is the challenge for you as a hotelier. Be creative about how you use those 3 options. And again, simple thing to check. Take your phone out, see what comes up, and ask your provider again. So that's principle 5.
I love when people share the information on the SSID. I've worked in hotels for years where you would have a dedicated SSID to different corporate clients. You'd have it for conference, you'd have it for guest Wi-Fi, etc. And it wasn't until I came to IMS that I realized actually that's the wrong thing to be doing. But nobody ever told me no. So it highlighted to me the importance of working with a partner who's going to advise you of this information, because ultimately they want the guest to have the best experience. So, you know, it's important that when your Wi-Fi provider advise you of something, they're thinking about it from the guest experience, from that technology experience. We might not always like the answer, but ask why, ask the reason why, because there's going to be a very valid reason behind it.
Yeah.
And Denis, what I'd love to cover next is guest Wi-Fi is something that we've been talking about for many, many years. And we know the importance of guest Wi-Fi, right? And how much more important it's becoming when you think about leisure guests, when you think about multiple devices, families traveling, etc., right? But there's not a lot of talk around the operational point of view, right? And the importance of Wi-Fi for a hotel's operation. So I'd love if you could discuss that in more detail, because it's not just about the guest experience, but it's also about the great Wi-Fi is going to offer the hotel opportunities to impact positively on staff and the hotel's P&L.
Absolutely, yes. So this is really interesting, right? Because again, as we looked at that ecosystem, we could see Wi-Fi was in one box, right? But when we think about how a hotel functions, right, there's so many other things outside of the guest experience that depend upon Wi-Fi. So I was having that conversation with a hotelier recently, and some of the things they come up with that were real in that building were like point of sale devices, back of house devices like wireless network printers, for example.
Mm.
All of the staff like work devices and their personal devices as well. Housekeeping and maintenance had an application on a smartphone that was provided by the hotel. They would then update their work on an application, when issues are resolved, when rooms are ready, etc. Again, that connected to the Wi-Fi, right? Digital signage in reception was actually on Wi-Fi. The self-service kiosks in reception were actually on Wi-Fi. We had online door locks connected through the IoT protocol in the Wi-Fi. We had meeting room technology, so they had some mobile sort of video conferencing screens and lots of other things like different IoT things around the building for automating and monitoring, and as well an extension of the phone network into like mobile phone handsets as well, all connected to the Wi-Fi, right? So that was a very interesting conversation. And again, you think about that idea of like 3 SSIDs or less, like so 3 wireless network names.
Mm-hmm.
In the background on great Wi-Fi, you split the networks. So think of it like a motorway.
Mm-hmm.
You've got 3 lanes, like one is for guests, one is maybe for your staff, one could be for say a conference or another some other function, right? And so like, then you understand that a site-wide managed Wi-Fi network is not just looking after your guests, but it's taking care of all the operational pieces as well. And then there's so much more now that you can do today with Wi-Fi, particularly on the IoT side. And we can maybe discuss that in part 2 as it relates to
Yeah.
sustainability. There's some amazing stuff being done at the moment, and we can go into some detail about that. But Wi-Fi is really important just for the smooth operation of your business, for really good guest scores, but from an operational perspective, for things to run smoothly. And you understand the staff challenge in the industry as well. If you
Mm-hmm.
have employees who just have a much better technology experience and can get their work done quicker, that is more fulfilling, and they're more likely to stay around long term. So yeah, really important, like way surpasses just the guest Wi-Fi network piece.
Brilliant. Absolutely fantastic. Thanks, Denis. And the final part in today's podcast that I want to touch on is I never realized the importance of a switch network. It's as important as a Wi-Fi network. And I suppose I never needed to know, because in my mind it just worked. And when it didn't work, there was somebody who called. So I think it would be great. You touched on the switch network as one of the 5 principles. I think it would be great to just return to that before we wrap up today's podcast and explain to everybody why a switch network is as important as a Wi-Fi network to a hotel.
Yeah, so the switches, essentially, they're what actually deliver internet access to the access point, but also power. And this is really important. So you think about PoE switches as power over Ethernet, right? So that means you can have an access point on the end of one cable as opposed to needing other separate local power supplies. So this means the whole method of deployment and your power consumption associated with your network can be reduced. Well-designed switch networks can facilitate all of those different operational requirements we spoke about earlier. So you can essentially connect any technology anywhere in the building onto that switch, and you can, in the background, we would say split out, separate that traffic so that, you know, the staff applications are totally separate to guests, etc. Right? But they give you that opportunity to consolidate services, and that reduces the amount of actual hardware and infrastructure you have in the building. That reduces your power consumption, etc. And the best design networks would have a situation where you might have a comms room with, say, 2 switches. And for example, on good Wi-Fi network design, you might put every second access point on a different switch. What that means is that if one switch fails, the other switch is operational from a power perspective, right?
Okay.
And when we design good Wi-Fi networks, we have like a primary signal and a secondary signal. And the secondary signal is at a threshold where you can still have a good experience. So for example, if you lost a switch then in a comms room, yes, you've half your access points offline, but every second access point is connected to the other switch, and that still means that a guest service can run really reliably, right? So a well-designed switch network has a huge amount of benefits. It can reduce your capital costs associated with your overall technology because you're consolidating services. It can reduce your energy costs, and it can be designed in a resilient way so you have some service available if one device fails.
I have so many more questions, but we promised we wouldn't go on. Denis, that was absolutely fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to part 2 in this particular podcast series. And thank you so much for that. It's going to be great to take a further look at Wi-Fi, especially from a sustainability point of view. We've touched on IoT, which is the Internet of Things. These are sensors, etc., that are out in the market. And I suppose it's a hot topic at the moment that people are trying to get a better understanding of. So yeah, there's a lot more to be discussed. Thank you so much. And I'd love to know, I know we have our 5 principles and we'll put them in the show notes, but for you, can you just summarize what the key takeaways are for today, please?
Yeah, I like the 5 principles are really important, and there's such a great starting point. With my business hat on, right, if you can create a great Wi-Fi experience for your guests, your repeat bookings will obviously increase, your guest satisfaction levels will increase, and that's all very strongly linked to occupancy, RevPAR, and ADR. And then from an operational perspective, if you get this, what we call the foundation, right, so that switch and Wi-Fi network correct, you can layer on so many other things that can deliver efficiency in terms of how your staff operate in the building. And as we said, we'll talk about the IoT bit in part 2. But I'll pause it there because there's so much more, and I'm just conscious of not overloading people with information, giving people a chance to digest the points made today. And I'm really looking forward to exploring this more in part 2.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Denis. And the one thing I will say to anybody who's listening, if you're in a hotel and you're wanting to just consider what your Wi-Fi performance is currently like, you can take a WhatsApp call and walk around the building, but write down those 5 principles that Denis just shared with you. Go to your Wi-Fi provider and start to take a look at what the performance is like for your existing customer base from an operational point of view, but also start to look at, okay, well, how good is the infrastructure? How good is this network for the technology that's coming down the road? And a lot of this technology is already here. We're just not using it in our business because we haven't learned enough about it yet. And that's what we're going to try and support everybody on. So, Denis, thank you so much for today. And thanks so much to everybody for listening. And I hope everybody has a good day. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Helena. Thanks, everyone.